Welcome to the Historical Table, History Colorado's program that brings together archives and food to learn more about our state's history. My name is Rachael Beyer. I'm the John W. Emery Family Assistant Curator of Oral History here at History Colorado. Today we are going to talk about canning, a versatile process that has deep roots in Colorado's homes and in its food production industry. Canning is a preservation technique. It's used to extend the life of food through heat, through pasteurization that is, and by reducing the amount of food being exposed to oxygen. We see the birth of commercial canning in Colorado in the 1880s and 90s. Most production facilities were centered in the greater Denver area and in Larimer County, which were both locations adjacent to lots and lots of fruit and vegetable farms. So it gave them very, very close geographical access to the types of produce, fruits and vegetables that they were going to be processing in their plants. Well, home versions of pressure canners were, the safety pressure canners were available in the 1920s. Most households could not afford to purchase them, and so continued to use water bath canning as their primary means of home preservation. Because most people today don't have a pressure canner in their pantry, we're going to jump forward in time a little bit to when home preservation really focused on water bath canning. I'm going to show you two recipes today. One, we're going to stop in the 1930s and look at how the waste not, want not mentality comes across in canning recipes. And then we're going to jump forward to the 1990s when a renewed interest in home canning met up with the foodie movement and started to produce really interesting and high-end canning recipes. Now we're going to move a bit forward in time to the 1930s, to the Great Depression. Colorado, like every other state across the nation, struggled during this time of social and economic crisis, and a lot of families needed to find different ways to get by economically. And home canning became a really important part of that. By 1930, the home pressure canner had been around for about 20 years at that point, and so pressure canning at home was starting to rise. However, most people found that they could preserve what they wanted using a water bath canner. And water bath canners have been around for a really long time. They're essentially just a very large vessel with a lid that allow for jars to be put in, for it to be filled with water, and for it to be processed. And water bath canning is really great for a really large variety of foods, anything that's high acid. So fruits are naturally high acid foods, as are tomatoes. And other foods that are low acid, like cucumbers and beans and other foods that don't have a lot of natural acid, can actually have their acid increased by adding vinegar. And once vinegar is added, that increases the acid enough that foods can be processed safely with a water bath canner. So during the Great Depression, people also wanted to make sure that they weren't wasting any food. And so today we're actually going to make watermelon rind pickles. And because obviously the insides of watermelon are wonderful, and I picked up a Rocky Ford watermelon, which of course around our state is a much desired and craved watermelon. And I picked mine up from my local farmer's market, who's carrying Rocky Ford watermelons. And to make watermelon rind pickles, you actually need to start with your watermelon. I've cut, mine's a mini seedless, so I've cut mine into quarters. And before you cut it much smaller, before you cut out your watermelon meat, you want to peel the outside. It's much easier to do it in large pieces. So we're gonna start by just peeling the outside of our watermelon with a vegetable peeler. That's pretty easy to do when you have it in large pieces. And you're just removing the green part, because the part that we want for watermelon rind pickles is the white part, the pith. So we're just gonna remove all of our skin from our watermelon. The Great Depression, during the Great Depression, a lot of people, if they hadn't canned before, started canning because we have such wonderful fruit here in Colorado. And so, so that was very easy and accessible to can. We have cherries and watermelons. We have apples, all sorts of different kinds of melons. So there's lots and lots of bounty. We also have lots of naturally growing berries. And so that makes a really wonderful variety of options. So once you've cut all of your watermelon and peeled it, then the next thing to do is to just cut up your watermelon like you normally would. So I have gotten all of my watermelon peeled, and I've got all these rinds left over. The next thing we need to do is we need to remove the pink part from the rind that's left. So anything that's left that's pink, kind of like this or like this, will end up mushy after pickling. So we want to remove all of that. You can use your vegetable peeler for that. You can use a knife for that. I myself have found that a grapefruit spoon, which is one of these spoons that has the ridges on the edge, I have found that a grapefruit spoon works best to remove all the pink parts that are left. So we just want to scrape that off so that that pink is mostly gone. A little bit is fine, something like that is just fine. Once you have finished your fleshing, you're taking all the pink flesh off. I cut mine into smaller pieces too, so that the pieces are all about the same uniform size, something you can eat with a fork. And don't let this go to waste either, because it's all flesh. So I'm gonna put it in a jar and set it aside in the fridge and maybe make myself a Rocky Ford cocktail later on. So I'm gonna use that for that, or you could throw it into a smoothie. So once you have your rinds ready to go, then you want to liberally apply salt. I like to use kosher salt because it's nice and big and chunky. And the purpose of doing this is to extract additional moisture out of the pickles. And so I'm just going to put in about a quarter to a half a cup. I mean, like, depending on the size of your watermelon, it will make a difference. I've just got a mini watermelon, and toss it so that all of the watermelon is coated, and it'll look like that. When you finish, you should be able to see the salt on everything. And then I'm just going to cover it and put it in the fridge for 24 hours. And that will give the salt really time to extract all the extra water. As we know, watermelons are a lot of water. Extract all that extra water from the rind itself. So it's been 24 hours since we put our watermelon in the fridge. And depending on how watery your watermelon is, you can see there's a fair bit of water that has accumulated at the base of the bowl. So you just put that into a strainer, and we want to rinse all the excess salt off. I'm just gonna do that. And then dump them into our stock pot. We need to boil the rind a little bit more to get it softer. And so we are going to cover the rinds with a 50-50 ratio of vinegar and water. And then I'm going to put that on the stove and get that boiling. In the meantime, we're going to start the syrup for the syrup for the pickles. The syrup, we want 1 quart of vinegar and 3 pints of sugar. I'm actually going to have that recipe for mine because I remember I started with quite a small watermelon. But we're going to get that into the saucepan. We're also going to add whole allspice, cloves, and cinnamon. Now our recipe did call for cinnamon, but I don't actually have cinnamon sticks, and we want to use whole whole spices for this. And so I'm actually going to substitute cardamom pods for cinnamon. Cardamom is a spice that's used a lot in Indian cuisine. It's the prominent flavor in chai tea, and I really like it as a substitute for cinnamon. So I almost always substitute cardamom pods for cinnamon stick. But again, we're going to go with the mentality that we're using for this Great Depression era recipe, and I'm going to make do with what I have in my cupboards. So once you have your whole spices, you want to get a piece of cheesecloth. I like to use just a piece of unbleached muslin because then I can rewash it and use it later, as opposed to cheesecloth, which is disposable. And you don't need to be real exact about your spices because they're not actually they're going to flavor our syrup, but they're not actually going to be in the syrup at the final product. So I'm starting with maybe, for mine, remember I've got a smaller watermelon. I'm going to go with maybe a half a teaspoon of allspice, whole allspice. About the same for whole cloves, half a teaspoon. And then finally, cardamom pods, I'm going to add about the same. So I've got about a teaspoon and a half of whole spices that I'm going to add in there. And then I'm just going to roll this up and tie it in a knot. And I have my spice packet complete. So I'm just going to make my syrup, I'm just going to get my sugar and vinegar thrown in the pot, throw in my spice ball, and bring it up to a boil. And the idea with the syrup is you want to reduce all the remaining liquid out of it to get it a nice thick syrupy consistency. So I'm going to go ahead and get this on the stove and get it on high. The watermelon rind is done reaching a boil. What you want to look for, this is still hot, but what you want to look for when poking it with a fork is almost the consistency of a not quite done potato. So you'll get start getting transparent, and you'll get a nice poke to it, like an almost done potato, not quite done, but almost done potato. Where you, what you'll see that it starts to become really transparent, and that's the point where you can take it off the boil. Now, the one thing I will warn all new to canning with vinegar folks out there is that the vapors that come off of boiling vinegar are very strong. You do not want to stick your face directly over those vapors. While it's boiling off mostly water, the vinegar comes along with it, and it can be quite overwhelming. So just don't stick your face in steam that's coming off of boiling vinegar. At the same time, I've got my sugar and vinegar and spice bag mixture going on the boiler behind the watermelon rinds. And let me show you what that looks like. Bring you along with me. Once it comes to a full boil like that, you can actually reduce it to a simmer, and it'll keep getting rid of all that extra liquid. And in the meantime, I have started preheating my hot water bath canner with the hot water in it. And I've got my jars out. I like to use wide mouth jars with pickles because they're just easier to access in the top. And I've got, with my small watermelon, I have 2 pint jars and 3 half-pint jars, and I think that'll probably do me for the amount of jars that I'm going to need. I'm also going to take this time while things are boiling down to get out all of my canning supplies. I've got my jar grabber, my largemouth funnel for canning, and the ladle as well. Now it's time to get our jars filled with the watermelon rind. And I just put it in the strainer, strain off that liquid. Again, you want to be careful of the the vinegar vapors. I'm just going to dish up the watermelon rind and get that in the jar. Shake it just a little bit. You always like your pickles. Anything you can, you always want to make sure it's nice and packed down in your jar. With canning, you always want things tightly packed. So I got that tightly packed. I ended up getting 4 half-pint jars out of my little watermelon. And we're still waiting for the spice syrup to boil down, to keep reducing to a thicker, more syrup-like consistency. But I thought that this would be a good time to talk to you about sugar. So yeah, sugar in canning, you always want to use white sugar. If you look for alternative recipes, you want to make sure they come through state extension agencies, because canning is very science-oriented, and changing the ratios of things or the quantities of things or substituting things, all of those things are possible in canning, but you just want to make sure that they're through a vetted recipe. Because once you put something in the canner to process it, sometimes it takes a while before you know if you've got a good product or not. You don't want something to go bad if you open a jar 6 months from now and you've used a sugar substitute and you spent all that time making your peaches or whatever, and 6 months later you go to enjoy a jar in January and it's gone bad because you were using a recipe that came from a non-extension source. So I strongly encourage the use of extension or published canning cookbooks. So, but I said I was going to talk about sugar, and that means history too, because we're here with the historical table. So during the Great Depression, sugar was actually easier to access in the state of Colorado because we had Great Western sugar here. And so a lot of the sugar was produced locally and therefore more accessible to local families that were looking to preserve their foods or sweeten their desserts. During World War II, sugar shortages became almost immediate. Sugar was the first food rationed during World War II. However, women across the United States threw up their arms and said, we cannot can our produce if we do not have access to sugar. And so a special ration book was actually created specifically for canning sugar. And it wasn't sugar that was any different from any other kind of sugar, but it was sugar that was specifically for the intended use of home canning, which was a really great way to be able to preserve locally grown foods, things that came out of victory gardens, for example, that left commercially produced foods, increased the availability of commercially produced foods, as well as industrial canning processes to be able to provide canned goods for our soldiers at home and overseas. Syrup is done. The way that you know that syrup is ready to go is you will see that bubbles start collecting on the surface and not going away. So almost kind of like when you make pancakes and the bubbles pop and they don't come back, then you know your pancake's ready to flip. The syrup is ready when bubbles start forming on the surface and don't go away. That means that there's enough viscosity to hold those bubbles in place. So we're going to go ahead and pull that off the heat and get it into our jars. Please be careful. It's going to be hot. And again, you've got the vinegar. We want to do 1/4 inch headspace on the jars. Headspace, as a reminder, is very important. Gives too much headspace and your goods could go bad. Not enough headspace and there's not enough room for pressure to build in the jar during the canning. I had a lot of syrup left over. If you have a really large watermelon, you may or may not. If for some reason you are short on syrup, you can make sure it gets evenly spread across your jars, and then you can just top off a little bit with vinegar. So that's okay if that happens. So once we have all of our jars done, again, clean towel, just wiping around the rim of the jar so that we get good sealing action. Used to be all the way up until recently that you had to boil your lids ahead of time so that you could ensure sanitation and also make sure that the seals would get heated up so that they would adhere. But a few years ago, the extension service said that wasn't necessary anymore. And if you come to our program on canning, we will show you some of the history of the canning jar. We've got lots of canning jars and canning equipment in our collection. So we'll show you some of those jars and show you the evolution of how it used to be much more complicated to can, and it's much easier now. So I've got my 4 jars ready, and my water is already boiling at a boil. So I'm just going to move my jars over there, grab my jar handle. My water bath canner, I like to just use a bamboo stir to lift off the pot. It's a little easier to do. Unlike a pressure canner, which requires a certain number of jars in the canner in order to maintain pressure, water bath canning doesn't need that. And now we need to wait for that to come back to a boil before we start counting our time. Just like with pressure canning, water bath canning is the amount of processing time for any given product changes based on elevation. And so if I was doing this on the East Coast where everyone basically lived in the same elevation, I just say it's X number of minutes and you could process it for that time. But here in Colorado, we are at lots of different elevations. So I'm on the Front Range, so I need to add a certain amount of time to my processing time, the basic processing time. So in an effort not to waste anything, because we're going Great Depression and wartime reserve style, I'm just putting my extra syrup. I happen to have quite a bit extra. I had a tiny watermelon into a jar. And once that's cooled to room temperature, I'm just going to stick it in the fridge. It's really great for quick summer bean salads. It's surprisingly delightful with its slight vinegariness in cocktails, particularly if you like shrubs in your cocktail, not the bush, but the vinegar shrubs that are herbal additives to cocktails. This is a really great thing to use in place of a shrub in a vinegar shrub in a cocktail. So don't waste it. Keep it around. Maybe you've got another watermelon coming to your home next week, and you want to do another couple of jars. Your syrup's all ready to go. So as soon as our 15 minutes is up, we're going to pull the jars, and we're done. So we've talked about commercial canning, we've talked about home canning, and now we move to about 25 years ago, to the 90s, where home canning makes a resurgence. A lot of that has to do with the interest in knowing where your food comes from, and just people finding out that canning is a fun activity to do, preserving your own food, and so forth. At the same time, commercial canning has taken a turn. And we start to see the revival of community canning facilities where small businesses want to produce their own food, but they can't afford the equipment and infrastructure to do large commercial canning processes. And so community canneries start being built in Colorado. The co-canning movement starts where people rent time and space to use production facilities so that small businesses in Colorado can really produce amazing stuff at a much lower cost to themselves and to their consumers. So for the modern movement, we're going to make pepper jam. And this is something that is a really great gift at the holiday season, or something really fantastic to take to parties. It's sweet, it's spicy, it's vinegary, and it makes a really great accompaniment to charcuterie trays, to cheese trays, and things like that at a party. So we're going to start off with chopped peppers. We want to do a total of 2 cups of pepper. And so here I have 1.5 cups of chopped sweet red pepper and 1/2 cup of Pueblo chilies, because we're here in Colorado, so we have to have those Pueblo chilies. And so we're going to start with 2 full cups of pepper. You can change the ratios depending on what you like. So we've got our 2 cups of peppers. I'm just gonna put those into a big stock pot. Pepper jam is super easy to make. So we're just gonna put those into the big stock pot. And I already have my pepper jars and ladle and lid set up, ready to go. I have my water preheating in the back burner there. And I'm just going to get all these peppers into the container. I also am going to add 1.5 cups of white vinegar. Then we also need 6.5 cups of sugar. So I put that on the heat, brought it up to, bringing it up to high. And once it comes to a boil, I'm gonna let it boil for 3 minutes. And 3 minutes will allow for the sugar to completely dissolve. It's gonna go from, if you're using white sugar, it's gonna go from cloudy to being completely transparent. And while we're doing that, we want to get our liquid pectin ready. And this recipe requires 2 packets of liquid pectin, which is what comes in a box. And we want to have this ready because as soon as our 3 minutes is up, we're going to want to add our pectin right away. So I'm just getting the pouches cut, and I'm just going to sit them upright in a mug or a glass so that they're ready to pour in a second. You can use other kinds of pectin as well. I just like the liquid for the hot pepper jam because it's just nice and quick and convenient to be able to dump right into the sugar when it's ready. Now it's time to add the pectin, which is easy enough to do. You just take your packets, dump them. You want to squeeze them so that the full amount of pectin from the packet goes in. Then you want to make sure it comes back up to a full boil. And once it hits that full boil again, 1 minute boiling with the pectin. And while we wait for that pectin to boil for its minute, I just want to share with you and encourage you to go out and check out some of our local Colorado businesses that are doing co-canning, that are using these facilities, that are making their own products, preserving their own products. Now our 1 minute timer is almost up. When that happens, it's going to beep. And we're just going to remove it from the heat, put it on a hot pad there, and we're going to let it sit for 5 minutes. You'll notice when you stir your jam that all the peppers float to the top. So the one thing that you do want to consider when you are putting this in the jars is that you don't end up with all the peppers in one single jar. It's nice to have a good amount of peppers in every jar. I like to use the 1/2 pint jars for pepper jam, although if you want to give them as gifts, you can use the 1/4 pint or the half pint jars, which are nice for gift giving. And you just, we've got our jar here with our funnel, got a nice amount of peppers in that. This recipe will make 6 to 8 half pints, depending on how much of your vinegar boiled off during boiling. And I'm just going to lift this up. You want to leave about a 1/4 inch headspace on your jar. And same way we did with our other things, we're going to use a nice clean towel to wipe off the rim and then put our lid on. And this is what our finished jar looks like. It's got kind of a little orange hue because we used a lot of sweet peppers. And so I'm going to go ahead and do that for all of them and repeat that with all of your jars. So I ended up with 6 half pints, and then I did 2 of the little jars, which would have been a total of 7 half pints. I always say, don't waste whatever you have left in the pot. So if there's just a little tiny bit left in the pot, with canning, you really want to make sure that you respect the headspace. So if it's a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch or 1 inch, you always want to respect the headspace in a jar. But just because you have a little bit left over doesn't mean you chuck it. You can put it into a jar. Don't process it, just stick it in your fridge, and then you have some of your new jam that you get to enjoy within a day or 2. So that's my suggestion. So I've got my jars ready to go, and my water is at a full boil. So I'm going to go ahead and get them in. Don't be surprised if your jars aren't sealed. It normally takes the reduction of heat to get that seal in place. So the next half hour or so, you'll get to hear satisfying little pop of the jar's sealing. The other thing with jams and jellies is that don't be surprised if it comes out looking really liquidy. The jam and jelly, the sugar vinegar mixture in our jam is quite hot, and as it cools down, it will solidify. I had a little bit left over. So I put it just in a jar here, and I can open this up and show you that already, just sitting in the fridge, we've got a nice jelly texture to it, just having that in the fridge for the 15 minutes it was boiling. So it sets up super nice, and you'll get this really nice color with the little pieces of pepper through them. So I hope you enjoyed the pepper jelly canning. It takes about an hour from start to finish, as long as you get your canning water preheating while you're chopping up your peppers and preparing everything. So super quick recipe, really nice to give for gifts or to take to parties. Thank you very much for joining me today on Historical Table, Preserving Colorado's Bounty. I really appreciate you spending the time with me today, and I hope that this has given you a couple of great recipes to take away, but also a glimpse into how important canning has been, both in Colorado homes and for Colorado entrepreneurs for more than 150 years.